From New York Times Opinion, I'm Lydia Polgreen.
I'm Michelle Cottle.
I'm Ross Douthat.
I'm Carlos Lozada.
And this is Matter of Opinion. Well, it's been a really, really long week of absolutely horrible news. The attacks and counterattacks between Hamas and Israel are continuing. Thousands of people have died. Many more are injured. You know, we're already living in a world where there is a major land war in Europe, in Ukraine, obviously. Lots of concerns about various geostrategic questions, China, a wave of coups in Africa. There's a lot going on in the world, and this just is another thing that makes me feel that we're living in this kind of wildly dangerous and unpredictable time. So we're going to get into all of that and what it means for the global order in the second half of our conversation. But I think we should focus on what's happening in Israel. Since the news is rapidly changing and will have changed again by the time this airs, I want to take a little bit of a long view. And I'm curious what you think, Carlos, because I think this is sort of your cast of mind. I mean, you know, is this Israel's 9/11? Or is it a replay of the Yom Kippur War, which was, you know, the invasion of Israel by Egypt and Syria that happened 50 years ago, almost to the day of this Hamas invasion? What do you think we're reaching for when you're looking for that kind of like metaphor and analogy in history?
I mean, I should emphasize this is not a region or a conflict over which I claim any expertise, but I do try to take a long view in my writing. And so in cases like these, I try to imagine precisely that, right? Like, how are people going to be thinking about this and framing this over the long term? And how useful are those frames? And one that I've been thinking about for the last couple of days, because it's been everywhere, is precisely the one you mentioned, that, you know, that this is Israel's 9/11. And there's something both sort of horrifying and yet weirdly comforting in the use of historical analogies. It's horrible that you have to reach for something of that magnitude to find any parallel for what happened. But when you say this is 9/11, or when you say this is Pearl Harbor, which is what people said on 9/11, you're also saying, I understand this. I have a frame of reference for this. And I came through this. We came through this out on the other side. So journalists, columnists, Israeli officials have all said this is Israel's 9/11. An IDF spokesman even said it was 9/11 and Pearl Harbor rolled into one. Actually, the one person who has come out and said that it's very much not 9/11 is our colleague Tom Friedman, who says that the al-Qaeda attack on New York and Washington was sort of unimaginable, whereas Israel constantly worries about Hamas doing stuff like this. I think Tom has a point, but I don't want to sort of litigate whether this is Israel's 9/11. Both events are horrific enough without having to rank order them. I think the 9/11 comparison, though, is instructive in a lot of ways. I'm struck by how this attack by Hamas was, you know, multi-pronged, very complex, but enabled by a lot of low-tech means. You know, yeah, there were commercial drones, but also, you know, bulldozers, paragliders, motorcycles. It reminded me of the box cutters on 9/11, you know?
Yeah.
The wall that Hamas sort of overpowered in part had cameras, you know, radar, underground sensors. Didn't matter. But the 9/11 comparison, I think, is interesting in the sense that, remember how quickly the, you know, we are all Americans vibe dissipated following 9/11. Remember how one of the outcomes of 9/11 was, I think it's fair to say, in part American overreach. We said that they attacked us because they hate our values of freedom, but in the ways that the United States responded to 9/11 over the 20 years that followed didn't always reflect our values. There are ways that this is Israel's 9/11, and there are ways in which I really hope it isn't.
Yeah, I mean, I of course was thinking of that too, and you know the ways in which America fundamentally lost its way post 9/11 and embraced, you know, forms of torture and spying on our own people and other sort of really serious moral lapses that, and I share with you that feeling. And I think one of the things that I'm feeling this week also is, you know, just a real sense of terror. I mean, there were these horrific atrocities that were committed against defenseless Israeli citizens. And, you know, now, of course, the Israeli military is pledging to go in and just kind of like roll through Gaza in a way that, you know, they've cut off the water, they've cut off the electricity. And, I think a lot about the people there. I mean, there's a big difference between the people of Gaza and Hamas. Hamas basically came into power in 2006 and has not, actually held elections again since then. And they have an iron-fisted rule over these 2 million civilians who are trapped in a very, very narrow piece of land with no way to escape.
I think the general consensus is that most people agree that one of the things Hamas wants is for Israel to overreact in some way. They want the videos that are popping up on Twitter of carnage and bloodshed in Gaza as the Israelis retaliate. That is something that will then challenge this kind of rallying around Israel. Once the retaliation starts and you see Palestinian civilians being caught in the crossfire, that changes the dynamic. And I think that Hamas is just kind of assumed to have factored that into what it was doing. It kind of wants that.
Well, and if they were explicitly hoping that this was going to be Israel's 9/11, then 9/11 and the response to 9/11 led to, Al-Qaeda mutated into ISIS. And, we ended up with the Islamic State and even more brutal, so I think one can see the directions that could spiral in. But if that's the hope, then Lord help us all.
I mean, fundamentally, Israel has to try to destroy the leadership of Hamas. This is the problem at this moment, is that independent of all sort of grand strategic considerations, and I obviously think that the lesson of 9/11 is that you can have a trauma that leads to overreach, overreaction, and disaster. And in that sense, it's an odd thing to invoke, right? If you say this was our Pearl Harbor, then you're invoking a huge defeat that was succeeded by ultimately an American triumph. If you evoke 9/11, you're saying this is just like this huge trauma that we, in hindsight, responded to with an unsuccessful overextension of American power. But with all of that said, there is no world in which Israel cannot attempt the sustained defeat of Hamas, whatever that may mean.
I mean, this is a super delicate tightrope, and I just don't know that Netanyahu, the prime minister, instills confidence that he's the guy to handle a lot of this.
Well, this is the other open question is whether, as happened in Israel after the Yom Kippur War, whether this effectively ends the Netanyahu era, if he's held fundamentally responsible for this failure politically. And this goes to our colleague's point about the difference with 9/11, right? As much as there were warnings that George W. Bush and his team may have ignored, there was no core reason to expect what happened on September 11th in the way that there was a core reason to expect, to some extent, attacks like this. And that, I think, puts Netanyahu in a much more difficult political position than Bush was in after September 11th.
Yeah. I mean, it's hard to know how this is going to unfold, obviously. But I was struck when President Biden spoke this week and, made a very, I think, stirring statement about standing by Israel. And he specifically referenced the former prime minister of Israel, Golda Meir, who led Israel through the Yom Kippur War. And I believe it was said to him directly that essentially the secret weapon of Israel is that its people have nowhere to go, which is absolutely true. And the same is true of the people of Gaza. So I think that there is this radicalizing effect of whatever comes next, and it just feels huge and unpredictable. And, it feels huge and unpredictable how all of this is going to play out for the rest of the world and also specifically for the United States. So when we come back, we're going to talk about that and much more. And we're back. So given everything we've just discussed, what kind of position does this put America in? Ross, this was the subject of a column that you wrote this week. Do you want to walk us through your thinking?
Such as it is, yeah. I think that I started the column by talking about George W. Bush's axis of evil speech. And in that speech, Bush famously suggested that there was some kind of alignment between Iran and North Korea and Iraq. that was, in some way parallel to the alignment between Imperial Japan and Nazi Germany. He didn't make this claim overtly because it obviously wasn't true. It was more of a rhetorical flourish. But I think at this point, we are closer to facing the United States a real alignment of hostile rival powers. If you look at Russia's ambitions in Ukraine, China's ambitions towards Taiwan, and frankly, Iran's role, whatever it may be, in supporting groups like Hamas in the Middle East, you've got three different theaters where powers that are basically sort of anti-American now in orientation, are interested in the end of American hegemony, are all either making moves or seemingly, in China's case, contemplating moves that America kind of has to play defense against. We, I think, are entirely correct to be supportive of Israel in this situation and to support their right and duty to go after Hamas. But in terms of our own grand strategy, we also have to sort of read events in Israel in light of events in Ukraine, in light of possible events around Taiwan, and somehow balance our various responses to these revisionist powers in a way that doesn't squander our resources and makes it possible for us to defend as much as possible Israel's position, Ukraine's position, and Taiwan's position, which is a hard thing to do.
Well, this is one of the things you see coming up through Congress are members pitching a package of aid from the U.S. that wraps all three of those theaters in together. And one of the problems is you have a split in the Republican conference about whether or not that's a good thing. But it is something that people are trying to kind of figure their way through.
When I first heard the news of what was happening in Israel, of the attack by Hamas, one of my first thoughts, even as you're sort of absorbing the horror of it, was like, God, I wonder if China would choose this moment to make a move. It just seemed like with the Biden administration having expressed such a firm commitment toward Ukraine and expressing a similar commitment toward Israel, it raises a question of sort of how committed can you be on how many fronts. Ross, your column inspired me to go read the Biden administration's national security strategy document from 2022.
I imagine it had that effect on most readers of the New York Times, in fact.
And I mean, the sort of multipolarity, dealing with challenges from so many sides and so many powers is pretty explicitly acknowledged there. I don't think we need to read a lot of tea leaves. At the very beginning, in the president's voice, it says the post-Cold War era, meaning the era of sort of the unipolar moment, right? The post-Cold War era is definitively over, and a competition is underway between the major powers to shape what comes next. Biden still says we're the leading power, but he recognizes we're not the only game in town. And his biggest concern really seems to be China. He says, Russia poses an immediate threat, an ongoing security threat in Europe, but it lacks the across-the-spectrum capabilities of the PRC. And so, to me, that was a useful way to kind of anchor the moment. And thank you to your column for pushing me there.
Well, I think the other thing that I've been thinking about is just this notion of like, are we or are we not living in a quote unquote rules-based order? I've obviously written a fair bit about this, what feels like a kind of might makes right moment. The questions about sort of what level of violence and civilian casualties will be tolerated in that pursuit, it goes right along all of the other big questions that we're asking about, like, what price are we willing to pay in order to solve these like, major global crises. So, yeah, I don't know. What's the state of the rules-based order at this particular moment, would you say?
Aspirational.
Yeah.
Aspirational, yes.
Tenuous.
Right.
No, I mean, yeah, I think what you're seeing, is certainly, there's obviously a long-running debate about to what extent said rules-based order ever fully existed. But clearly there's a sense in a lot of places that there are opportunities to sort of settle business that was difficult to settle at a different stage of American power. We're basically watching a kind of ethnic cleansing happen in Azerbaijan, where Armenians living in disputed territory are fleeing, and that's getting basically no attention. And I think even the Hamas stuff, right? Like when the Islamic State was perpetrating its atrocities, there was a sense of this as like this kind of total exception. It's like, all right, this is the reemergence of, people would always say, medieval barbarism. I think that, is sort of pejorative against the Middle Ages. There are plenty of medieval authorities who would have condemned what the Islamic State did. But there was this definite sense of its sort of exceptionalism. It was like, this kind of eruption of the barbaric past into the present. And Hamas, as much as they are a terrorist group, had been more normalized. And for them to sort of go full Islamic State also feels like they wouldn't have done it in a context where the international order felt more stable.
I mean, I think there is obviously a big calculation going on with other powers trying to figure out just how distracted the U.S. is, not only by its foreign matters, but also kind of what's going on here at home. I mean, obviously, Putin and others have been happy to point to all of the domestic Sturm und Drang over the last few years and say, this is not a well-run democracy. Projecting strength and stability isn't really what we've done in the last few years. And that has to just make everything that much more likely to fall apart elsewhere.
You're saying that removing a Speaker of the House for no particular reason in the midst of global crises is not
storming the Capitol,
strength.
trying to overthrow an election and being unable to actually have a functioning Congress. Yeah, all of those things are bad in terms of telegraphing American stability.
But I mean, it's also, agreed, but I also think that we're in good company. I mean, what was happening in Israel at the time that, right before this happened, as this huge threat is gathering, there is a giant fight over what I would certainly describe as a huge judicial power grab by Netanyahu. And there were really, really powerful warnings from people, people who were high up in the military or had served were saying like, this is causing division. This is going to have an impact on our security. And so you definitely see that come true. And so I'm just thinking about the episode that we did last week, or, you have Matt Gaetz and the congressman from Florida who started this whole process of removing Speaker Kevin McCarthy over, maybe principle, but also just kind of a personal beef. And there is this sort of reminder that we have a lot of very unserious politics happening at a time when the world just feels like incredibly deadly, deadly serious.
We also have an element of the Republican Party that Trump has kind of spoken to, which is increasingly isolationist. You've seen it with Ron DeSantis talking about Ukraine. You have J.D. Vance and Josh Hawley, who are, arguing constantly for ramping back aid to Ukraine. And there is this element that has gotten a little bit of a boost, that they want American out of foreign affairs and not policing the world. And I think that is something that has to be factored in as well.
I think, though, that what you see already in the response to events in Israel is how limited that kind of non-interventionism is to the specifics of the Ukraine conflict. A lot of those guys have made the argument that we are overinvested in Ukraine and underinvested in China. They're basically Asia first Republicans. And the first thing Josh Hawley said after the atrocities in Israel was, we should take Ukraine money, not send it home to build firehouses or bridges or something, but send it to Israel, which was, a ridiculous bit of pandering in a way, or, sort of made for Twitter moment, but also I think reflective of the fact that the number of true isolationists in the Republican Party is relatively small. And when it's Israel in the crosshairs, where the Republican Party has been deeply invested for my entire political lifetime, you're less likely to get people wanting to pull back.
Yeah, although I would argue that that's more because Israel has become a litmus test of sorts on the right more than Ukraine, say, being the outlier. I mean, Israel has a very special place in the Republican Party and in American foreign policy anyway that is more unique.
Yeah, I mean, I think the open question is what would actually happen if Taiwan was threatened? Because right now you have a lot of elite-level Republicans who are skeptical of aid to Ukraine, but favorable to support for Taiwan. I don't know what the popular support on the right, but more generally, would be for Taiwan in the event of a real conflict. I think that's something that just hasn't been tested.
No, but let me ask you guys this. I mean, I think one of the sort of pieces of received wisdom that I think is basically right is that Xi Jinping, the absolute ruler of China, had been somewhat chastened by the way things have gone for Putin in Ukraine. But I wonder if any of you have thoughts on who are the international actors that are looking at this situation and what lessons do you think they're going to draw from it based on the variety of ways that we could respond to it?
I think it's often tempting and easy to think of geopolitics as like individual leaders straddling their country, kind of looking at what everyone else is doing and, like this kind of multi-complicated chessboard. But a lot of it is just a response to what's going on in their own countries, their own sense of themselves as leaders. I recently read a good book called Party of One, The Rise of Xi Jinping and China's Superpower Future by Chun Wong of the Wall Street Journal. And it makes the case pretty clearly how there's this deep sense of kind of mission and destiny for Xi Jinping surrounding Taiwan. And I think that regardless of, what's happening with Putin here, what's happening with Israel over there, that kind of impetus is overpowering sometimes. And you can tell yourself a story about the international environment that suits what you want to do anyway.
And it also feels like the ability of any one player, even a player as powerful, even in our diminished moment as the United States, can't control for all those variables, and events are going to unfold in the ways that they're going to unfold. So being in the business of prediction and mind reading is not a good place for any of us to be at this moment.
I will say something, maybe not optimistic is the wrong word for it, right? But at least non-despairing, which is that we're in a moment where countries that are revisionist in their ambitions, that want to end American hegemony, and groups, including terrorist groups that they support, all seem emboldened. By the same token, these forces are not by any means carrying all before them. Hamas and Hezbollah are not actually capable of defeating Israel, and I don't believe that they will defeat Israel. Russia has not proven itself capable of defeating Ukraine. China's capacities in war are untested, and there are good reasons to believe, even now, in the resilience of some form. I'm hedging my bets here, but some form of sort of the U.S.-led order that we have all lived in for all of our lives. I would say it's too soon to count that order out.
All right. Well, we're going to leave it there. No hot cold this week, so take care, you guys.
See you soon.
Take care.
Bye, guys.
Matter of Opinion is produced by Sophia Alvarez-Boyd, Phoebe Lett, and Derek Arthur. Edited by Allison Bruzek. Our fact-check team is Kate Sinclair, Mary Marge Locker, and Michelle Harris. Original music by Isaac Jones, Afim Shapiro, Carol Saburo, Sonia Herrero, and Pat McCusker. Mixing by Carol Saburo. Audience strategy by Shannon Busta and Christina Samiluski. Our executive producer is Annie Rose Strasser.